Yeah, I checked, and there was nothing after that in the tea. The rain fell in thin sheets, tapping against the brim of Jackson Kane's battered fedora as he exited his rusted sedan. The headlights illuminated the towering silhouette of Blackwood Manor, an imposing estate whose windows glared like empty eyes in the storm. Jackson adjusted the collar of his trench coat, its fabric worn and frayed from years of relentless cases, and muttered under his breath, "Somebody must have wanted this guy dead real bad." Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old wood and something sharper, a faint metallic tang Jackson had come to associate with death. Sergeant Miller, a no-nonsense cop with a jawline sharp enough to cut glass, greeted him in the grand hall. "Suicide," Miller said flatly, gesturing up the ornate staircase to the study. "Shot himself in the head. Door was locked from the inside. No sign of forced entry." Jackson's eyes narrowed as he took in the details. The kind of details Miller had likely brushed past. The Persian rug at the study's entrance was slightly askew, its intricate patterns interrupted by a faint drag mark. Something had been moved. Or someone. He crouched, running his fingers along the fibers, then stood abruptly. "I need to see the body," he said. His tone left no room for argument. The study was dimly lit, the only illumination coming from a single desk lamp that cast long, claw-like shadows across the room. Mr. Blackwood's body slumped in a high-backed leather chair, his lifeless eyes staring at the ceiling. On the desk before him lay a pistol, too far from his hand to make sense. Jackson's gut churned. "Mind if I take a closer look?" he asked, already moving toward the body. Miller frowned but nodded. "Knock yourself out, Kane. Just don't mess up my crime scene." Jackson crouched beside the body, his sharp eyes scanning every detail. Something wasn't adding up. The position of Blackwood's arms felt staged, too stiff, too deliberate. His right hand was limp, fingers slightly curled, yet the pistol lay a full foot away on the desk. "Didn't know corpses could throw guns that far," Jackson muttered under his breath. Miller, leaning against the doorframe, didn't respond, his expression unreadable. The detective leaned in closer, his senses on high alert. A faint, bitter scent lingered in the air around the body. Almonds? His brow furrowed. Cyanide wasn't a common choice for someone who had supposedly shot themselves, but the smell was undeniable. "You smell that?" he asked, glancing back at Miller. "Smell what?" Miller shot back, his irritation evident. "All I smell is a shut case." Jackson didn't reply. Instead, he turned his attention to the desk. A small lamp cast a pale glow over scattered papers, letters, invoices, and a few open books on antique weaponry. Blackwood had been a collector, but Jackson wasn't here to admire his taste. He reached out for a large volume on the edge of the desk, but his hand froze midair. Something caught his eye. The edge of the Persian rug was curled up near the desk, revealing faint scuff marks on the wooden floor beneath. He knelt down, running his fingers over the marks. They were faint but deliberate, something heavy had been dragged. "Miller," Jackson called out, his tone sharper now. "Do me a favor and wait outside. I need a moment alone." Miller hesitated, the muscle in his jaw tightening. "What are you trying to pull, Kane?" "Just doing my job," Jackson replied evenly. "Unless you're planning to arrest me for that." With a reluctant grunt, Miller stepped out, the door clicking shut behind him. Jackson exhaled, finally alone. He stood and began a slow, methodical sweep of the room, his eyes darting between the furniture, the walls, and the floor. If this was a suicide, it was the strangest one he'd ever seen, and Jackson Kane had seen plenty. He turned his attention to the body once more, his trained eye catching the smallest inconsistencies. The blood spatter on the wall didn't match the angle where Blackwood supposedly fired the gun. His hands were too clean, no gunpowder residue. And then there was the faint smell of almonds again, clinging to the air like a ghost. Jackson crouched by the desk, his fingers brushing against the floor where the scuff marks led. He followed them slowly, his hand tracing the faint trail until he reached the edge of a bookshelf. His brow furrowed. The scuff stopped abruptly. Standing up, he inspected the bookshelf more closely. The spines of the books were neatly aligned, but one caught his attention. It protruded just slightly, as if it had been hastily replaced. He pulled it out, revealing a small, locked compartment behind it. A hint of a smile crossed his lips. "What were you hiding, Blackwood?" he murmured. The lock was old but well made, and Jackson knew better than to force it open. For now, he memorized its placement and returned the book to its spot. His instincts told him this wasn't just about a simple locked room mystery. Something larger was at play, and he didn't plan on leaving without answers. Just as he turned back toward the desk, he heard it, a faint creak of a floorboard outside the door. Jackson froze, his hand instinctively reaching for the revolver holstered under his coat. But the sound faded as quickly as it had come, leaving only silence in its wake. Jackson stayed still for a few seconds longer, his ears straining for any follow-up sound beyond the wind rattling the windows. Nothing. Slowly, he let his hand fall from his holster, but the unease remained. He stood and moved to the desk, resuming his search. His fingers brushed across the papers scattered across its surface, but they offered no immediate insight, just mundane correspondence and receipts for recently acquired antiques. He sighed, then crouched again to inspect the floor near the chair. The blood pooling beneath Blackwood's head had spread unevenly, but Jackson's eyes caught something unusual. A faint smear trailed toward the edge of the rug, where it seemed to overlap with the scuff marks he'd noticed earlier. It was subtle, but the implication was clear: someone had moved the body. He reached out, tugging the rug aside just enough to expose what was beneath. Wood polished smooth over the years stared back at him, but there was something else, a faint scratch, almost like a key had been dragged across the floor. It pointed toward the bookshelf he'd just inspected. Jackson stood, his eyes narrowing at the hidden compartment he'd discovered moments ago. Whatever Blackwood had locked away, someone else had been looking for it too. Maybe they'd even found it. He cursed under his breath and reached for his notebook, jotting down a few quick observations to revisit later. Before he could finish, the door creaked open, and he turned sharply. A young woman stepped into the room, her face pale and streaked with tears. She held a small bouquet of lilies, their white petals trembling in her hands as much as her fingers. I'm sorry," she stammered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't know anyone was in here." Jackson straightened, slipping his notebook back into his pocket. "And you are?" he asked, his tone gentle but firm. "Emily," she said, blinking rapidly as if trying to compose herself. "I'm the housekeeper. I just wanted to pay my respects. Mr. Blackwood, he was always kind to me." Jackson's gaze softened, though his mind remained sharp. "You knew him well?" She nodded, clutching the flowers tighter. "As well as anyone could. He was private, but he wasn't like this." Her eyes darted to the body, and her face crumpled. "He wouldn't have done this. He wasn't that kind of man." Jackson stepped closer, his voice low. "What makes you so sure?" Emily hesitated, her lips trembling. He was happy. At least, he seemed that way. But lately, she trailed off, biting her lip. Jackson tilted his head. "Lately what?" Her voice dropped to a whisper. He was scared. Nervous. He kept locking things away, muttering about someone coming for him. I don't know who or why, but he wouldn't tell me. He trusted me, but not enough to share everything. Jackson filed that away, his mind working fast. Did he mention anyone? A name, maybe? Or something specific he was afraid of? Emily shook her head helplessly. No, nothing like that. Just that he didn't trust anyone but me. And he kept talking about his collection, the pieces he owned. He said there was something in it that was different. Something dangerous. Jackson's eyes sharpened. Dangerous how? I don't know, she admitted, her voice barely audible. But he made me promise, if anything ever happened to him, I had to protect it. Whatever it was. Jackson crossed his arms, steadying her. There was a vulnerability in her posture, but her words carried weight. Do you know what it is he wanted you to protect? No, she said quickly. I swear, I don't. Her voice broke again, and she clutched the flowers tighter. I just know he wasn't suicidal. Jackson nodded, his expression softening slightly. I believe you, Emily. But I need you to tell me everything you can remember, no matter how small it seems. She hesitated again, casting a nervous glance at the door. I should go. The police, they don't want me talking to anyone. Jackson's eyes narrowed slightly. You'll be fine. Just tell me what you know. Emily hesitated but eventually relented, her voice barely above a whisper. There's a diary. He kept it hidden somewhere in this room. Nobody else was allowed to read it. If you can find it, maybe it'll explain everything. Jackson's mind was already racing. A diary. That might be the key to unraveling this mess. He nodded. Thank you, Emily. You've been a big help. She gave him a watery smile, then turned and slipped out of the room, her footsteps fading down the hall. Jackson waited until the sound disappeared entirely before turning his attention back to the study. A diary. If Blackwood had hidden it, it was likely somewhere close by. He scanned the room, his eyes settling on the bookshelf again. This time, he moved with purpose, pulling books one by one until he found what he was looking for. Behind an oversized tome on medieval weaponry, he discovered a small, leather-bound journal. Its lock had been broken, the edges of the cover frayed as if someone had forced it open. He flipped through the pages quickly, noting the scrawled handwriting and scattered sketches of various artifacts. But one word stopped him cold. It was written in bold letters across one page, underlined several times. Beneath it, Blackwood had scribbled a frantic note, "The shadow follows. The contract is binding. Trust no one." Jackson's stomach tightened. Whatever Blackwood had gotten himself into, it wasn't just about antiques. This was bigger, much bigger. And if that wasn't enough, the faint sound of footsteps returned, this time heavier, more deliberate. Jackson cursed under his breath and slipped the diary into his coat. He moved quickly to the corner of the room, ducking behind a tall screen just as the door creaked open again. Jackson held his breath behind the screen, his fingers instinctively brushing the grip of his revolver. The footsteps paused just inside the doorway, their owner hesitating, as if sensing something was off. Through the narrow gap between the screen and the wall, Jackson could just make out a pair of black shoes stepping cautiously across the hardwood floor. The faint rustling of fabric followed, and then the figure moved closer to the desk. It wasn't Miller. The movements were too light, too hesitant. Jackson heard a muffled sniffle, and then the soft sound of something being placed on the desk. Slowly, he leaned just enough to see. It was Emily, the housekeeper. She was placing the bouquet of lilies next to Blackwood's lifeless hand, her shoulders trembling with barely restrained sobs. Jackson relaxed slightly, though his mind was still racing. What was she doing back here? He waited until she turned to leave, her footsteps retreating down the hall, before stepping out from behind the screen. His eyes flicked to the bouquet. The gesture was touching, but it didn't answer his questions. If anything, her return only deepened the mystery. Deciding he couldn't afford to waste time, Jackson turned back to the journal. He flipped back to the page with the word Tenebris scrawled across it, his eyes narrowing as he read the scribbled notes beneath it. Blackwood's handwriting devolved into near illegibility, but the fragments he could make out sent a chill down his spine. The serpent watches, a deal I can't break. Tonight, it ends. Tonight, Jackson murmured. Blackwood's death hadn't been an accident, and it sure as hell wasn't a random act. Someone had been here, someone who wanted him silenced. And the cryptic notes about the serpent and Tenebris hinted at something far more sinister than a simple locked room mystery. His attention snapped back to the present as he heard a faint creak from down the hall. Someone else was here. This time, the footsteps were heavier, more deliberate. Jackson moved quickly, slipping the journal into his coat and heading for the door. He eased it open just enough to peer out into the hallway. The light from the study spilled into the corridor, but beyond that, it was dark. The footsteps echoed softly, growing fainter as they moved farther away. Whoever it was, they weren't coming toward him. Jackson stepped out into the hall, his movements silent as a shadow. He followed the sound, keeping close to the wall, his eyes darting to every corner and doorway. The footsteps led him to the main staircase, where he paused, listening. The creaking of wood below told him the person had gone downstairs. He descended cautiously, his hand never straying far from his weapon. The grand foyer was dimly lit, the flickering light from a single chandelier casting eerie shadows across the space. The front door was ajar, and the faint glow of a street lamp illuminated the figure slipping out into the night. Jackson quickened his pace, stepping outside just in time to see the figure disappear around the corner of the estate's wrought iron fence. He hesitated for a moment, debating whether to follow, but the sound of a car engine starting ended the debate for him. By the time he reached the street, the taillights of a black sedan were already fading into the rain-soaked darkness. Jackson cursed under his breath and turned back toward the house. Whoever it was, they'd been in a hurry to leave. But why? And what had they been looking for? He needed answers, and he had a feeling they were still inside Blackwood's study. Back in the study, Jackson resumed his search. He inspected the compartment behind the bookshelf more thoroughly this time, but it was empty. Whoever had broken the lock had likely taken whatever was inside. Frustrated, he turned his attention to the desk. The papers scattered across its surface seemed mundane at first glance, but Jackson's trained eye caught subtle inconsistencies, creases where pages had been folded and unfolded repeatedly, as if someone had been referencing them often. One document in particular caught his attention. It was a receipt for a golden key, custom-made and engraved with a serpent motif. The date was recent, just 2 weeks ago. Jackson's eyes narrowed. A key. Was it connected to the compartment? Or to something else? He tucked the receipt into his pocket, making a mental note to dig deeper into it later. As he straightened up, his gaze fell on the fireplace. Above the mantel hung an ornate mirror, its gilded frame glinting faintly in the lamplight. But what really caught his attention was the set of antique clockwork mechanisms on the mantel itself. Among them was a small clock shaped like a coiled serpent, its intricate design eerily similar to the engraving described in the receipt. Jackson leaned in closer, his fingers brushing against the clock's surface. It was heavier than it looked, and when he lifted it, he noticed a small keyhole hidden beneath the base. His heart quickened. The golden key. It had to fit this. But the key wasn't here. Whoever had taken it was likely the same person who had fled moments ago. Jackson set the clock back down, frustration gnawing at him. He was close, he could feel it, but the pieces weren't falling into place fast enough. A sudden vibration in his coat pocket startled him. He pulled out his phone, frowning at the unknown number flashing on the screen. He answered cautiously. Kane. A deep, accented voice crackled through the line. You're meddling in things you don't understand, detective. Leave this alone, or you'll regret it. The line went dead before Jackson could respond, but the threat lingered in the air like a bad omen. He stared at the phone for a long moment, then slipped it back into his pocket. Whoever was behind this wasn't just dangerous, they were watching him. And if they thought a phone call would scare him off, they clearly didn't know Jackson Kane. His jaw tightened as he turned back to the desk, his determination hardening. This wasn't just about solving a case anymore. Blackwood's death was part of something bigger, and Jackson wasn't about to walk away. Not now. Not ever. Jackson paced the study, his thoughts swirling like the storm outside. Whoever had called him wasn't bluffing, they knew he was here, and they wanted him gone. That only made him dig his heels in further. If Blackwood's death tied into something bigger, then Jackson needed to unearth every clue before it was too late. He glanced at the clock on the mantel again, the serpent coiled around it feeling less decorative and more symbolic with every passing second. The golden key was still missing, but the receipt suggested it had been commissioned for a purpose, one Blackwood hadn't lived long enough to fulfill. He returned to the papers on the desk, flipping through them with renewed urgency. Several invoices listed acquisitions for rare artifacts, but one in particular caught his eye, a reference to an item labeled the Shard of Tenebris. It had been purchased at a private auction only a month ago, and the buyer's name listed was none other than Blackwood himself. Jackson frowned. The name matched the cryptic word scrawled in the journal, and the description of the item, a black crystal fragment of unknown origin, felt unnervingly ominous. If this shard was what Blackwood had been protecting, then it was likely what had gotten him killed. Suddenly, the faint sound of whispers reached Jackson's ears. He froze, his head snapping toward the study's door. The whispers weren't coming from the hallway, though. They were closer, softer, almost imperceptible. He scanned the room, his pulse quickening. The sound seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, a low murmur that flickered between intelligible words and static-like noise. He moved toward the bookshelf, where the sound grew louder, clearer. Tenebris, the binding, the serpent devours. Jackson's hand hovered over the bookshelf, his heart pounding in his chest. His fingers traced the spines of the books, searching for anything out of place. Then he found it, a slim volume with no title, its black cover devoid of markings. He pulled it from the shelf, and the whispers stopped abruptly, plunging the room into an almost deafening silence. The book was old, its leather cover cracked with age. Jackson flipped it open carefully, revealing a series of hand-drawn illustrations and notes written in a language he didn't recognize. The sketches depicted strange symbols and serpentine figures, their eyes glowing with an otherworldly intensity. One page caught his attention, a crude map of what appeared to be Blackwood Manor, with a single room marked by an X. His breath hitched. The marked room wasn't the study. It was the basement. Jackson tucked the book under his arm and headed for the door, his steps purposeful. He descended the grand staircase once more, the creaking wood underfoot echoing in the empty halls. The basement door was tucked away near the back of the house, concealed behind a heavy curtain. Jackson pulled the curtain aside and tried the handle, only to find it locked. He gritted his teeth and reached for his pocket, pulling out a set of lock-picking tools. It took him less than a minute to bypass the lock, and the door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase leading into darkness. The air in the basement was damp and cold, carrying the faint scent of mildew and something metallic. Jackson flicked on his flashlight, the beam cutting through the gloom. The walls were lined with shelves filled with boxes and crates, but it was the far corner of the room that drew his attention. A large, rectangular shape loomed in the shadows, covered by a thick tarp. As he approached, the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. Something about this place felt wrong, like the air itself was heavier. He reached out and pulled the tarp away, revealing an ornate wooden chest bound with heavy iron bands. The craftsmanship was exquisite, the carvings on the surface depicting coiling serpents and jagged lines that seemed to form a protective seal. At the center of the chest was a small keyhole, the engraving around it matching the serpent motif from the receipt. Jackson's pulse quickened. This was it. The golden key had to unlock this chest. But the key was still missing, and Jackson wasn't about to wait for whoever had taken it to come back and finish the job. He drew his knife and wedged it into the seam of the chest, applying just enough pressure to pry it open. The lock resisted for a moment before giving way with a sharp crack. The lid creaked open, revealing its contents, a black crystal shard resting on a bed of crimson velvet. The shard was small, no larger than a dagger, but its surface seemed to shimmer and shift, as if shadows danced within it. Jackson reached out cautiously, his fingers brushing against the crystal's surface. A jolt shot through him, and for a split second, his vision went dark. Images flashed before him, serpents coiling around a towering figure, a contract written in blood, and a voice that whispered, "The debt must be paid." Jackson staggered back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Whatever this shard was, it wasn't just an artifact. It was a piece of something far more dangerous, and he had a sinking feeling that Blackwood had known exactly what it was. The whispers returned, louder now, filling the room with an almost unbearable pressure. Jackson grabbed the shard, wrapping it in a piece of cloth before shoving it into his coat pocket. He had to get out of here. As he turned to leave, the basement door slammed shut above him, plunging the room into total darkness. Jackson's flashlight flickered, then died, leaving him alone with the whispers that now seemed to come from every direction. His hand went to his revolver, the weight of it grounding him in the oppressive void. "Who's there?" he barked, his voice steady despite the adrenaline pumping through his veins. The whispers coalesced into a single voice, deep and resonant. "You shouldn't have taken it, detective. The serpent always collects its due." Jackson's grip tightened on his weapon. "Yeah? Well, it'll have to get in line." The air around him grew colder, the shadows deepening as if they were alive. A shape began to emerge from the darkness, its form shifting and writhing like smoke. Jackson raised his revolver, taking aim at the apparition. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't going to stop him. Not now. Not ever. Jackson emerged from the basement into the rain-slicked night, the cool air biting at his face as he took a deep breath. The storm had subsided, leaving behind a heavy, suffocating quiet that blanketed Blackwood Manor. He glanced back at the house, its looming silhouette seemed darker than before, as if it had absorbed some of the malevolence that lingered in the basement. His fingers brushed against the broken shard fragments in his pocket. They felt heavier than they should, as though they carried with them the weight of whatever curse Blackwood had been bound to. Miller hadn't followed him out. Fine. The detective wasn't in the mood to explain the unexplainable. He'd let Miller stew in the basement for a while. It wasn't like the guy was going to make sense of what had just happened anyway. Jackson's focus was already shifting. Blackwood's death wasn't random, and now that he had a taste of the darkness swirling around it, he knew it was only the beginning. Somewhere out there, someone, or something, was pulling the strings, and Jackson was determined to cut those strings before they wrapped around his own neck. As he walked toward his car, parked under the pale, flickering glow of a street lamp, the faint crunch of gravel behind him made him pause. His hand instinctively went to his revolver, his body tensing as he turned. A figure stood at the edge of the driveway, barely visible in the dim light. It was Emily, the housekeeper. Her shoulders were hunched, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as if trying to ward off the cold. "You shouldn't be out here," Jackson called, his voice low but firm. "It's not safe." Emily hesitated, her face pale and drawn. I needed to talk to you," she said, her voice trembling. "I know you found something. Something important." Jackson sighed, motioning for her to come closer. She approached hesitantly, her eyes darting nervously toward the manor. When she reached him, she spoke in a hurried whisper. "When you were in the study, I remembered something. Mr. Blackwood, he told me once that if anything happened to him, there were people, dangerous people, who would come looking for what he had." "Too late for that," Jackson muttered, glancing back at the house. "They've already started." Emily's hands trembled as she clutched the edges of her coat. "I don't understand any of this. He was always so careful, so private. But in the weeks before he died, he became someone else. He was scared, paranoid. He kept saying he couldn't trust anyone, that someone was watching him." Jackson frowned. "Did he ever say who? Or why?" She shook her head. "No. But he mentioned a name once. Tenebris. I didn't know what it meant, but it terrified him. He said it wasn't just a name, it was something bigger." Jackson's stomach tightened. The word had been scrawled in Blackwood's journal, tied to the shard and whatever nightmare it represented. He reached into his coat, pulling out the broken fragments wrapped in cloth. Emily recoiled slightly, her eyes widening as if she could sense the shard's lingering malevolence without even touching it. "This," Jackson said grimly, holding it up. "This is what he was protecting. And this is what got him killed." Emily stared at the bundle, her face pale. "What is it?" Jackson hesitated. He wasn't even sure himself. "It's a piece of something old. Dangerous. And whatever it's part of, someone out there wants it bad enough to kill for it." She took a shaky step back, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then why are you carrying it? If it's so dangerous, why not get rid of it?" Jackson's jaw tightened. Because I don't know what happens if I do. And until I figure that out, this stays with me. Emily looked as though she wanted to argue, but before she could, the unmistakable sound of a car engine roared in the distance. Jackson's head snapped toward the sound, his instincts kicking in. The car was approaching fast, its headlights cutting through the darkness as it barreled down the winding road toward the manor. "Get inside," Jackson barked, pushing Emily toward the house. "Now." She didn't argue, sprinting toward the door as Jackson ducked behind his car, drawing his revolver. The vehicle screeched to a halt just a few yards away, its tires kicking up gravel. The driver's side door swung open, and a man stepped out, his silhouette tall and broad-shouldered. He wore a dark trench coat, the brim of his hat casting a shadow over his face. Jackson couldn't make out the man's features, but he didn't need to. The way the man moved, calm, deliberate, like a predator, told him everything he needed to know. "Detective Kane," the man called, his voice smooth and cold. "You've been busy tonight." Jackson's grip on his revolver tightened. "Yeah, well, it's been that kind of evening." "You must be the welcoming committee." The man chuckled, the sound devoid of humor. "I'm here for the shard. Hand it over, and I'll let you walk away." Jackson smirked, though his pulse quickened. "You're gonna have to be more specific. My pockets are full of junk." The man stepped closer, his hands remaining in his coat pockets. "Don't play games, detective. You don't understand what you're dealing with. The shard doesn't belong to you. It belongs to us." "Us?" Jackson asked, keeping his tone light even as his mind worked furiously. "And who's that? Some kind of secret snake cult? You guys have a catchy name, or do you just hiss at each other in meetings?" The man's smile faded. "Mockery won't save you, Kane. The shard is cursed. It binds itself to whoever touches it. You think you're in control, but you're not. It's already inside you, and it will consume you." Jackson's smirk faltered slightly. He hated how the man's words seemed to echo the whispers he'd heard in the basement. But he wasn't about to show weakness. "If that's true," he said, raising his revolver, "then maybe I'll take you down with me." The man sighed as though disappointed. "So be it." In a flash, he moved, faster than Jackson expected. A glint of steel caught the corner of Jackson's eye, and he rolled to the side just as a knife embedded itself in the car's door where he'd been crouched. Jackson fired a shot, but the man was already moving, ducking behind the cover of his own car. The night erupted into chaos, the sharp cracks of gunfire echoing through the still air. Jackson moved with precision, his years of experience as a detective kicking in as he calculated his opponent's movements. But the man wasn't just fast, he was methodical, every move designed to drive Jackson into a corner. Jackson ducked behind his car, his breath coming in quick bursts. He was outmatched, and he knew it. But he wasn't about to go down without a fight. His fingers brushed against the shard in his pocket, and for a moment, he hesitated. The man had said the shard was cursed, that it would consume him. But maybe, just maybe, that curse could work both ways. Jackson's fingers tightened around the shard fragments wrapped in cloth. The idea of using something he didn't fully understand made his skin crawl, but the alternative was worse. He wasn't about to let some trench-coated assassin take him out in a driveway like it was just another Tuesday. His pulse hammered in his ears as he weighed his options, the faint hum of the shard's presence growing stronger the longer he held it. A sound to his left snapped him back to the moment, a scrape of a shoe against gravel. The man was flanking him. Jackson cursed under his breath, his grip shifting on his revolver. He only had a few shots left, and wasting them wasn't an option. The shard pulsed again, a faint warmth bleeding through the cloth, and Jackson felt a strange calm settle over him. It wasn't comforting, it was predatory, like a wolf circling its prey. "Come on, Kane," the man called out, his voice cold and steady. "You're not walking away from this. You're only making it harder on yourself." Jackson smirked despite the tension coiling in his chest. "Yeah, well, hard's kind of my thing." The man's laugh was low and humorless. You're stalling. I don't need to kill you, detective. I just need the shard. But if you force my hand. Before the man could finish, Jackson sprang from behind cover, his revolver raised. He fired twice, aiming for the man's center mass, but the trench-coated figure moved with inhuman speed, dodging to the side. Jackson dove back behind his car as another knife whistled past, embedding itself in a nearby tree trunk with a dull thunk. "You're fast," Jackson called out, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "Guess that's what happens when you sell your soul to a snake cult." The man didn't respond immediately, but Jackson could hear the faint crunch of gravel as he advanced, slow and deliberate. "You think this is a joke," the man finally said, his tone dripping with disdain. "You have no idea what you're dealing with. That shard isn't just cursed, it's alive. It's watching you. And it's already started to take root." Jackson's jaw tightened. He didn't know if the man was trying to rattle him or if the warning was genuine, but it didn't matter. He wasn't about to let some cryptic nonsense shake him. He glanced at the shard in his pocket again, the warmth now accompanied by a faint vibration, almost like a heartbeat. "You talk too much," Jackson muttered, gripping the revolver in one hand and the shard in the other. His thumb brushed the edge of the cloth, and for a split second, he considered unwrapping it. The memory of the vision it had shown him, the serpents, the blood, the whispers, flashed through his mind, but he shoved it aside. Desperate times called for desperate measures. He stepped out from behind the car, his movements quick but controlled. The man was waiting for him, a knife glinting in his hand, but Jackson didn't give him time to react. He hurled the shard-wrapped cloth toward the man, the motion instinctive and fueled by raw adrenaline. The man's eyes widened as the bundle arced through the air, and he instinctively caught it. The moment his fingers closed around the shard, the air seemed to ripple, a low hum vibrating through the ground. The man staggered back, his expression twisting in pain and fury. What have you done?" he growled, his voice distorted, almost inhuman. Jackson didn't waste the opening. He closed the distance in 2 quick strides, slamming the butt of his revolver into the man's temple. The force of the blow sent the trench-coated figure sprawling to the ground, the shard still clutched in his trembling hand. Jackson stood over him, his revolver aimed squarely at the man's chest. "You want to explain what just happened?" Jackson demanded, his voice hard. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like your cursed rock doesn't like you much." The man's eyes flickered up to Jackson, his pupils dilated and his face pale. He looked different. Older, somehow, as though the shard had drained the vitality from him in a matter of seconds. His hand twitched, the shard slipping from his grip and landing on the ground with a faint clink. "You don't understand," the man rasped, his voice weak. "It's not meant for you. It's meant to feed." "Feed on what?" Jackson pressed, but the man's body convulsed suddenly, his back arching off the ground as a guttural scream tore from his throat. Jackson stepped back, his revolver still trained on the man, but it was clear he wasn't getting any more answers. The man's scream faded into a wet gurgle, and then his body went still. Jackson stared at him for a long moment, his mind racing. Whatever had just happened, it wasn't normal. The shard lay on the ground between them, its surface dull and lifeless, but Jackson didn't trust it. He grabbed the cloth it had been wrapped in and used it to scoop the shard up, careful not to touch it directly. As he straightened, the sound of sirens in the distance reached his ears. Miller. Of course, the guy couldn't just stay in the basement and keep his head down. Jackson cursed under his breath. He didn't have time for questions or red tape, not with the shard still in his possession and whatever madness it was tied to still out there. He slipped the cloth-wrapped shard back into his coat and hurried to his car. As he climbed in, the weight of the shard seemed heavier than ever, like it was pulling him down. He started the engine, the rumble masking the sound of the approaching sirens, and pulled away from the manor without looking back. The road ahead was dark and winding, but Jackson's grip on the wheel was steady. The shard wasn't just a cursed artifact, it was a puzzle piece, part of something much larger. And as much as he hated to admit it, he was now part of that puzzle, whether he liked it or not. One thing was clear, this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Jackson drove through the night, the rhythmic sound of the tires against the wet road doing little to calm his nerves. The shard, now wrapped tightly and tucked into his coat pocket, seemed to pulse faintly, almost as if it were alive. It didn't make sense, but then again, nothing about tonight had. He gripped the wheel tighter, his mind racing through every clue, every piece of evidence he'd uncovered so far. Blackwood's paranoia, the journal, the cryptic mentions of Tenebris, and now the trench-coated man who had died with that warning on his lips, it all pointed to something bigger, something darker than Jackson had anticipated. The city lights came into view as he approached the outskirts of town. He had no destination in mind, no plan other than to keep moving. But even as he drove, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. His eyes darted to the rearview mirror, scanning the empty road behind him. Nothing. Just the shadows cast by his taillights and the faint glow of the moon breaking through the clouds. Still, the unease settled deep in his gut, like a predator waiting just out of sight. He needed answers. And there was only one place he could think of that might have them. The bell above the door jingled softly as Jackson stepped into the dimly lit shop. The air inside was thick with the scent of incense and old paper, and shelves lined with dusty tomes and strange artifacts loomed on either side of him. The shop was a relic of another time, a place most people walked past without a second glance. But Jackson knew better. If anyone in the city could shed light on the shard and its connection to Blackwood, it was the woman who ran this place. Detective Kane, a voice called from the back of the shop. It was low and smooth, tinged with amusement. It's been a while. Jackson turned to see a woman emerge from behind a curtain of beads. She was tall and striking, her dark hair falling in loose waves around her shoulders. Her eyes, sharp and knowing, seemed to pierce through him as she approached. She wore a flowing black dress adorned with silver pendants, each one etched with symbols Jackson couldn't begin to decipher. "Isolde," he said, nodding in greeting. "I need your help." She arched an eyebrow, a sly smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "You usually do. What have you gotten yourself into this time?" Without a word, Jackson reached into his coat and pulled out the shard, still wrapped in the cloth. He placed it on the counter between them, watching as Isolde's expression shifted. The amusement faded, replaced by something colder, something wary. "Where did you get this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "It belonged to a guy named Blackwood," Jackson replied. "He turned up dead a few days ago. I've been trying to piece together what happened, and this thing keeps showing up in the middle of it." Isolde reached out, her fingers hovering over the cloth, but not quite touching it. "Do you have any idea what this is?" "Not a clue," Jackson admitted. "But I'm guessing you do." She pulled her hand back, crossing her arms over her chest. "It's a shard of Tenebris." The name sent a chill down Jackson's spine. He'd heard it before with Blackwood's journal, the trench-coated man, and now Isolde. "You're gonna have to give me more than that," he said, his tone firm. Isolde sighed, her gaze lingering on the shard. "Tenebris isn't just a name. It's a force. A presence. Some call it a god, others a curse. But whatever it is, it's ancient. Older than anything you or I could comprehend. The shards are pieces of its essence, scattered and hidden for a reason." Jackson frowned. "And what happens if someone finds one?" Her eyes met his, her expression grave. "They don't just find it. It finds them. The shard binds itself to whoever touches it, feeding off their fears, their desires, their very essence. And it doesn't stop until there's nothing left." The weight of her words settled over him like a lead blanket. "So you're saying this thing is alive?" "In a sense," Isolde said. "But it's more than that. It's a gateway. A connection to Tenebris itself. And if someone were to reunite the shards," she trailed off, her voice faltering. "What?" Jackson pressed. "What happens?" "Then Tenebris comes through," she said quietly. "And the world as we know it ceases to exist." Jackson let out a low whistle, running a hand through his hair. Well, that's just great. So, what do I do with it? Destroy it? Bury it? Toss it in the ocean and hope for the best? Isolde shook her head. You can't destroy it. Believe me, people have tried. The shards are indestructible. And as for hiding it, she hesitated, her gaze dropping to the shard. You might delay the inevitable, but it won't stop. The shard will find its way back into the world. It always does. Fantastic, Jackson muttered. So I'm stuck with this thing? For now, Isolde said. But there's one option. It's risky, dangerous, even, but it might sever the shard's connection to you. I'm listening, Jackson said, leaning forward. Isolde's eyes locked onto his. There's a ritual. An ancient one. It requires a blood offering and a binding circle strong enough to contain the shard's energy. If it works, the shard will lose its hold on you. And if it doesn't? Jackson asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted the answer. Then the shard consumes you, Isolde said simply. And you become its vessel. Jackson exhaled sharply, leaning back against the counter. Sounds like a hell of a gamble. It is, she said. But if you don't do it, the shard will destroy you anyway. Slowly. Painfully. It's already started. Her words brought back the man in the trench coat, his face pale and twisted as the shard drained the life from him. Jackson's hand went to his coat pocket, feeling the faint warmth of the shard through the fabric. All right, he said after a moment. What do I need for this ritual? Isolde regarded him for a long moment before nodding. Follow me. Isolde led Jackson through the bead curtain and into the back of the shop. The air grew heavier, the scent of incense giving way to something sharper, almost metallic. The room was dimly lit by candles, their flickering flames casting long shadows across the walls, which were lined with shelves filled with jars, bones, and ancient tomes. A large circular table dominated the center of the space, its surface etched with intricate symbols that seemed to pulse faintly in the candlelight. This is where we'll do it, Isolde said, her voice steady but somber. But before we begin, you need to understand something. This isn't just about you. The shard has already started its work. If we fail, it won't stop with you. It will spread. Spread? Jackson asked, his brow furrowing. What do you mean? Isolde turned to face him, her expression grave. The shard is a fragment of Tenebris, a piece of its essence. By binding itself to you, it's using you as a conduit. If it takes you completely, it won't just consume you, it will open a door. And once that door is open, there's no closing it. Jackson let her words sink in, the weight of them pressing down on him like a lead blanket. He dealt with his share of nightmares in his career, murderers, conspiracies, things that kept him up at night, but this was something else entirely. This wasn't just about solving a case or catching a killer. This was about survival. His, and maybe everyone else's. All right, he said finally, his voice firm. What do I need to do? Isolde stepped closer to the table, gesturing for Jackson to join her. First, place the shard in the center of the circle. But don't touch it directly. Use the cloth. Jackson nodded, pulling the shard from his pocket. Even through the fabric, he could feel its faint pulse, like a second heartbeat. He unwrapped it carefully and placed it in the center of the table. The shard gleamed faintly in the candlelight, its surface dark and smooth, as if it were absorbing the light around it. Isolde's expression hardened as she began gathering items from the shelves, candles, vials of strange liquids, and a ceremonial dagger with a blade so thin it looked like it could slice through air. She arranged the items around the table with practiced precision, her movements quick but deliberate. This ritual requires 3 things, she said as she worked. Energy, intention, and blood. The energy will come from the circle. The intention must come from you. And the blood, she paused, glancing at Jackson. Well, that's self-explanatory. Jackson smirked, though his nerves were beginning to show. Great. Blood magic. Just what I needed to round out my night. Isolde ignored the comment, lighting the candles one by one and muttering something under her breath. The symbols on the table began to glow faintly, their light pulsating in time with the shard's heartbeat. Jackson watched as the air in the room seemed to grow thicker, heavier, like the atmosphere before a storm. "Step into the circle," Isolde instructed, her voice firm. Jackson hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward, positioning himself opposite her. The glow of the symbols intensified as he crossed the boundary, and he felt a strange tingling sensation crawl up his spine. Isolde handed him the ceremonial dagger, its hilt cool and smooth in his hand. "You'll need to make an offering," she said, her tone softening slightly. "Just a few drops. Enough to seal the circle and bind your intention." Jackson raised an eyebrow. "You sure this isn't just your way of getting me to do your blood tests?" Isolde shot him a look. "Do you ever stop joking?" "Not when I'm holding a knife and standing in a magic circle, no." She sighed, clearly unimpressed, but didn't press the issue. Jackson took a deep breath, gripping the dagger tightly before pressing the blade against the palm of his hand. The cut was shallow, but the sting was sharp, and blood welled up immediately. He let a few drops fall onto the shard, watching as the dark surface absorbed the crimson liquid like a sponge. The reaction was immediate. The symbols on the table flared to life, their glow so bright Jackson had to shield his eyes. A low, resonant hum filled the room, vibrating through his chest and making his teeth ache. The shard began to tremble, its surface rippling like water disturbed by a stone. "Focus, Jackson," Isolde shouted over the noise. "You have to concentrate. Think of what you want, what you need. The shard will try to fight you, but you have to push back." Jackson clenched his jaw, his mind racing. What did he want? What did he need? The answer came to him almost immediately. He needed to end this. To stop whatever nightmare Blackwood had unleashed and make sure no one else suffered because of it. He closed his eyes, focusing all his thoughts on that single goal. The hum grew louder, almost deafening, and the air around him seemed to crackle with energy. Images flashed through his mind, visions of serpents coiling in darkness, of voices whispering in a language he couldn't understand, of the trench-coated man's face twisted in agony. He felt the shard pushing back, its presence like a weight pressing down on his chest, trying to crush him. But he pushed harder. "Not today," he growled through clenched teeth. "You're not taking me. You're not taking anyone." The shard's resistance intensified, but Jackson held his ground, his entire body trembling with the effort. The symbols on the table blazed brighter, the hum reaching a fever pitch. And then, with a sound like shattering glass, the shard went still. The light faded, the hum dissipating into silence. Jackson opened his eyes, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The shard lay on the table, its surface dull and cracked, as if the ritual had drained it of whatever power it held. Isolde stepped forward cautiously, her eyes scanning the shard. "It worked," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You severed the connection." Jackson let out a shaky laugh, leaning heavily against the table. "Well, that's a relief. I was starting to think I'd have to start charging rent to the thing living in my head." Isolde didn't laugh. Her gaze flicked to him, her expression still serious. "This isn't over, Jackson. The shard may be dormant, but it's not gone. And there are others out there who will stop at nothing to get it." Jackson straightened, his exhaustion replaced by a renewed sense of determination. "Let them come," he said. "I'm not done yet." Jackson pocketed the now dormant shard, wrapping it tightly in the cloth again, as if the act itself could keep its darkness contained. He looked up at Isolde, who was meticulously extinguishing the candles around the circle. Her movements were careful, deliberate, but her expression gave her away. She was worried. "What's the next step?" Jackson asked, his voice steady but low. He hated how heavy his own hand felt from the cut, but the sting was nothing compared to the weight of the night's events. Isolde hesitated, snuffing out the last candle before turning to face him. "The next step is survival. You've severed the shard's immediate hold on you, but you've also marked yourself. The others will know. The others? Jackson frowned, his exhaustion giving way to irritation. You've mentioned this twice now. Who the hell are they? Isolde leaned against the counter, crossing her arms. Her gaze was sharp, her voice calm but edged with urgency. The ones who serve Tenebris. There's always been an order, people who have dedicated their lives, their souls, to finding the shards and bringing them back together. They believe it's their sacred duty to see Tenebris rise again. They call themselves the Veil. Jackson snorted. Sounds like a bad fan club. It's worse than that, Isolde said sharply, her tone cutting through his sarcasm. The Veil has been around for centuries. They're patient, methodical, and relentless. They've infiltrated governments, corporations, religious institutions, you name it. And now that you've come into contact with the Shard, you're on their radar. Let them come, Jackson said, his jaw tightening. I'll deal with them the same way I dealt with their trench-coated friend outside Blackwood's place. Isolde's expression hardened. You're underestimating them. That man you killed? He was nothing. A pawn. The Veil doesn't send their best for retrieval work, they send their hunters for cleanup. If you think tonight was bad, you're not ready for what's coming. Jackson felt a flicker of unease, but buried it under his usual bravado. So what do you suggest? Hunker down? Run? I'm not exactly the hiding type. No, Isolde said firmly. You can't run. They'll find you. Your best chance is to get ahead of them. Learn everything you can about the Shards, about Tenebris, and about the Veil. If you know what they're after and why, you might stand a chance. Jackson rubbed a hand over his face, the weight of it all settling on his shoulders. You've got a plan for that, I take it. Isolde gave a small, humorless smile. I know someone who might have answers. A scholar. He's been researching the Shards and the Veil for years, though I doubt he'll be thrilled to see you. Why's that? Jackson asked, arching an eyebrow. Because he prefers the shadows, she replied. And because the last time I saw him, he swore he was done helping anyone who got themselves tangled up in this mess. Great, Jackson muttered. Sounds like a real people person. Where do I find him? Isolde hesitated, then pulled a scrap of paper from a drawer. She scribbled something down and handed it to him. His name is Elias Calder. He's holed up in an old library about 2 hours from here. It's off the grid, buried in the woods. He's paranoid, so don't expect a warm welcome. Jackson glanced at the address before folding the paper and tucking it into his pocket. Paranoid's fine. I'm not exactly feeling sociable myself. Isolde stepped closer, her expression softening slightly. Be careful, Jackson. Elias might have answers, but he's also sitting on a lot of dangerous knowledge. Knowledge the Veil would kill for. If they're not already watching him, they will be once you show up. Noted, Jackson said, tipping an invisible hat. Anything else I should know? Isolde hesitated, then nodded. Yes. Don't trust anyone. The Veil has eyes everywhere, and they're not always who you'd expect. Even the friendliest face can hide a dagger. Jackson gave her a long, searching look, then nodded. Thanks for the warning. And for all of this. Isolde's lips twitched into something resembling a smile. Just try not to get yourself killed, detective. The world's dangerous enough without Tenebris coming back. The drive to the library was uneventful but tense. The night stretched on, the darkness outside his car windows feeling heavier than usual. Jackson couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, though every time he checked his mirrors, the road behind him was empty. Still, the paranoia gnawed at him, and he found himself gripping the wheel tighter than necessary. The address Isolde had given him led to a narrow dirt road, barely wide enough for his car. Trees loomed on either side, their branches twisting together to form a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. The deeper he drove, the more isolated he felt, until finally, he spotted a faint glow in the distance. The library was a hulking structure, its stone facade withered and overgrown with ivy. It looked more like an abandoned monastery than a place someone would willingly live. Jackson pulled his car to a stop and climbed out, the cool night air biting at his face. He approached the heavy wooden door, his footsteps crunching on the gravel path. He knocked once, twice, then stepped back, waiting. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, just as he was about to knock again, the door creaked open, revealing a man in his late 40s with disheveled gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses. His eyes were sharp and suspicious, darting over Jackson like he was sizing him up for a fight. "Elias Calder?" Jackson asked. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced past Jackson, scanning the darkness beyond the doorway. Satisfied that Jackson was alone, he finally spoke. "Depends." "Who's asking?" "Detective Jackson Kane," he said, holding up his badge. "I need to talk to you about the shards." At the mention of the shards, Calder's expression darkened. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, moving to shut the door. Jackson jammed his boot in the doorway, stopping it from closing. "Cut the crap. Isolde sent me. She said you could help." Calder froze, his grip on the door tightening. "Isolde," he repeated, his tone wary. "Yes," Jackson said. "She told me you're the guy who knows more about this mess than anyone else. So unless you want me camping out on your doorstep, I suggest you let me in." For a moment, Calder looked like he was going to argue. But then he sighed heavily and stepped aside, motioning for Jackson to enter. The inside of the library was just as imposing as the outside. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the walls, filled with ancient tomes and manuscripts. A large wooden table in the center of the room was covered in papers, maps, and what looked like fragments of stone similar to the shard Jackson carried. "Talk," Calder said, shutting the door behind him. "And make it quick. If Isolde sent you, it means trouble's not far behind." Jackson didn't hesitate. "I've got a shard. Blackwood had it before he died. Now it's dormant, but the people who want it aren't." Calder's face went pale. "You brought a shard here," he hissed. "Are you insane?" "Probably," Jackson replied. "But I didn't have much of a choice. Look, Isolde said you know what these things are and how to deal with them. So start talking." Calder ran a hand through his hair, muttering something under his breath. "If they're after you, you've already put me in danger just by showing up. But if you've severed its connection, we might have a small window to act." "Act how?" Jackson asked. Calder met his eyes, his expression grim. "To destroy not just the shard, but the Veil's entire operation." Jackson crossed his arms, his jaw tightening. "Destroy the shard, destroy the Veil, sounds ambitious. Care to explain how you plan to do that when Isolde just told me these things can't be destroyed?" Calder paced the room, his fingers twitching as if they were itching to grab one of the many books scattered across the table. Finally, he stopped and turned to face Jackson, his expression intense. "Isolde's not wrong. The shards themselves can't be destroyed by conventional means. They're fragments of something far older and far more powerful than anything we understand. But there's a way to neutralize them, to sever their connection to Tenebris permanently." Jackson raised an eyebrow. "And I'm guessing it's not as easy as tossing it in a furnace?" Calder let out a dry laugh. "If it were that simple, the shards wouldn't still exist. No, what I'm talking about is dangerous. Suicidal, even. But if you're serious about stopping this, it's the only chance we've got." "Well, don't keep me in suspense," Jackson said, leaning against the edge of the table. "What's the plan?" Calder hesitated for a moment, then grabbed a large, leather-bound book from one of the shelves. He flipped it open, the pages brittle and yellowed with age, and laid it on the table in front of Jackson. The page was filled with strange symbols and a detailed sketch of what looked like a massive, ancient structure, part temple, part fortress. "This," Calder said, tapping the drawing, "is the Sanctum of Umbra." Jackson frowned, studying the image. Never heard of it. I'm not surprised, Calder said. It's been lost for centuries. The sanctum was built by the first people to discover the shards. They realized what the fragments were, pieces of Tenebris, and they tried to contain them. They created the sanctum as a prison of sorts, a place where the shards could be sealed away, cut off from the world and from Tenebris itself. And I'm guessing it didn't work out too well for them, Jackson said dryly. Calder's lips pressed into a thin line. No. The Veil found them. They slaughtered the sanctum's guardians, took the shards, and scattered them across the world. But the sanctum still exists, hidden, forgotten. If we can find it, we can use it to seal the shard you have. Maybe even destroy its connection to the others. Jackson rubbed the back of his neck, staring at the sketch. All right, let's say I believe you. How do we find this place if it's been lost for centuries? Calder flipped to another page in the book, revealing a map. The details were faint, the ink faded, but it was clear enough to make out the rough outline of a mountain range. The sanctum is buried somewhere in these mountains. I've spent years piecing together clues, old texts, rumors. I think I know where it is, but getting there won't be easy. Jackson let out a low whistle. Of course it won't. Let me guess, treacherous terrain, no cell service, and probably guarded by something that doesn't like visitors. Something like that, Calder said, his tone grim. And if the Veil catches wind of what we're doing, they'll come after us with everything they've got. They'll stop at nothing to keep that shard out of the sanctum. Jackson glanced at the shard, still wrapped in cloth and tucked into his coat. The weight of it seemed heavier now, the stakes clearer than ever. So it's a race, he said. Get to the sanctum before the Veil gets to us. Exactly, Calder said. And there's one more thing you need to know. Of course there is, Jackson muttered. Hit me. The sanctum's defenses were designed to keep Tenebris's power contained, Calder said. That means the shard itself will fight us. The closer we get, the harder it will push back. You've already felt its influence, it's only going to get worse. Jackson exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. Great. So not only do we have to dodge cultists and climb a mountain, but I've also got to keep this thing from turning me into its puppet. Calder nodded. That about sums it up. Jackson straightened, his expression hardening. All right. When do we leave? Calder blinked, caught off guard by the question. You're serious? Dead serious, Jackson said. You think I've come this far just to sit back and wait for the Veil to show up at my doorstep? If this sanctum is the only shot we've got, then we're going. Calder studied him for a moment, then nodded. We'll leave at first light. I'll need time to gather supplies, and you, he glanced pointedly at Jackson's hand, which was still wrapped in a makeshift bandage. Should get some rest. You'll need it. The Veil's shadow. As Jackson settled into a worn armchair in Calder's study, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were already being watched. The library was quiet, the only sounds the faint rustle of papers as Calder prepared for their journey. But the silence felt wrong, like the calm before a storm. He closed his eyes, hoping for a moment of peace, but instead, his mind was flooded with images. The shard's visions were growing stronger, serpents writhing in darkness, whispers that tugged at the edges of his sanity. He could feel the shard's presence like a shadow in his mind, pressing against the walls of his thoughts. A sudden knock at the door jolted him awake. Calder froze, his hand halfway to a stack of maps. He exchanged a tense look with Jackson before moving cautiously toward the door. Don't open it, Jackson said, standing and drawing his revolver. Calder hesitated, then nodded, stepping back. The knock came again, louder this time. Jackson moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. He couldn't see anything, but the uneasy feeling in his gut told him someone, or something, was out there. The knock turned into a pounding, and a voice called out, muffled but urgent. Calder! Open the door! It's me! Calder's eyes widened. That's... Wait, Jackson interrupted, holding up a hand. Who is it? It's Marcus, Calder said. He's an old colleague. He knows about the shards. Jackson's grip on his revolver tightened. And you trust him? Calder hesitated, then shook his head. I don't know. Not anymore. The pounding grew more frantic, the voice outside growing louder. Calder. They're coming. Let me in before it's too late. Jackson exchanged a look with Calder, then moved toward the door, his revolver at the ready. If he's lying, we'll find out the hard way. He opened the door a crack, just enough to see the man outside. Marcus was disheveled, his face pale and slick with sweat. His eyes darted around wildly, as if expecting an attack at any moment. They're right behind me, Marcus gasped. The veil, they know about the shard. They're coming for you. Jackson pulled the door open just enough for Marcus to slip inside. The man stumbled through, clutching his side as if he'd been running for miles. His clothes were torn, and there was a gash along his temple, blood trickling down his face. Calder immediately moved to lock the door, his hands trembling as he slid the heavy deadbolt into place. Slow down, Jackson said, keeping his voice low but firm. He kept his revolver at his side, not quite ready to lower it. Who's coming? How far behind you are they? Marcus leaned against the wall, gasping for breath. His eyes darted between Jackson and Calder, wild with panic. The veil, he managed to choke out. They've been tracking me for weeks. I thought I lost them, but tonight they were waiting. They know about the shard. They know you have it. Jackson's grip tightened on the revolver. How do they know? Marcus shook his head, his breath still ragged. It's the shard. They can sense it. The closer they get, the stronger the pull. It's like a beacon. Fantastic, Jackson muttered, glancing at Calder. You left that part out. It's not always the case, Calder said defensively. The shard's connection was severed, temporarily, at least. It shouldn't be broadcasting its presence unless... Unless? Jackson pressed, his voice sharp. Calder hesitated, his face pale. Unless someone reinforced the connection. Marcus's head snapped up at that, his expression stricken. No, he whispered, shaking his head. No, that can't be. The only way to do that is with blood magic. And if he cut himself off, his face going even paler. What? Jackson demanded. If they've what? Marcus swallowed hard, his voice trembling. If they've already started the ritual to reunite the shards. The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling over them like a suffocating fog. Jackson exchanged a grim look with Calder, his mind racing. If that's true, Jackson said slowly, then this isn't just about stopping them from finding this shard. It's about stopping them from getting to any of the others. Exactly, Marcus said, his voice urgent. If they complete the ritual, it won't matter where the shards are. Tenebris will manifest through them, and it'll be unstoppable. Calder stepped forward, his brow furrowed. How do you know this? Marcus hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. Because I helped them. Years ago. Before I understood what they were really trying to do. Jackson's eyes narrowed, and he took a step closer, his revolver still in hand. You're telling me you worked with the Veil? I didn't know. Marcus said quickly, raising his hands in a gesture of surrender. I thought they were scholars, researchers. They said they were trying to study the shards to keep them safe, to prevent them from falling into the wrong hands. By the time I realized what they were really after, it was too late. And now we're supposed to trust you? Jackson said, his voice cold. You don't have a choice, Marcus shot back, his voice rising. I know how they think, how they operate. If you want to stop them, you need me. Jackson stared at him for a long moment, his jaw tight. He didn't trust Marcus, not yet, but there was something in the man's eyes, a desperation that felt genuine. He glanced at Calder, whose expression was equally conflicted. Fine, Jackson said finally, lowering the revolver but not holstering it. But if you're lying to me, or if you try anything. I won't, Marcus said quickly, nodding. I swear. Good, Jackson said. Because if we're going to stop the veil, we need to move fast. Calder, do you have everything we need to find the sanctum? Calder nodded reluctantly. Most of it. I still need to gather a few things, but we can leave within the hour. Make it sooner, Jackson said. He turned to Marcus. You're coming with us. If you know how the veil operates, you can help us stay ahead of them. Marcus hesitated, then nodded. All right. But we need to be careful. If they're tracking the shard, they'll already be closing in. Jackson nodded, his mind already running through the possibilities. The veil wasn't just a cult, they were organized, methodical, and ruthless. If they were coming, it wouldn't be long before they reached the library. And when they did, Jackson had a feeling it wouldn't just be a polite knock at the door. They didn't have to wait long. Calder was halfway through packing supplies when the first sign of trouble came, a faint rustling outside the library, so soft it could have been the wind. Jackson froze, his hand instinctively going to his revolver. He motioned for Calder and Marcus to stay quiet, then moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. At first, he saw nothing. Just shadows and trees, their branches swaying in the breeze. But then, just at the edge of the clearing, he caught a flicker of movement, dark shapes slipping through the trees, too fluid and deliberate to be animals. They're here, Jackson said quietly, stepping back from the window. At least 3 of them, maybe more. 3? Marcus whispered, his voice trembling. That's just the advance group. They'll send more once they're sure you're here. Then we don't give them the chance, Jackson said. He turned to Calder. Do you have a back way out of here? There's a basement, Calder said. It leads to a tunnel that comes out about half a mile from here. But it's narrow. If they follow us in there, we'll have nowhere to run. It's better than sitting here waiting to get surrounded, Jackson said. Grab what you can carry. We're leaving now. Calder nodded, his movements hurried but efficient as he stuffed maps, books, and supplies into a large duffel bag. Marcus hovered near the door, his hands shaking as he clutched a makeshift weapon, a heavy iron candlestick. Jackson moved to the center of the room, his revolver raised. The rustling outside was growing louder now, closer. He could feel the tension in the air, the sense of something terrible about to happen. And then, it did. The windows shattered all at once, glass raining down as dark figures burst into the room. They moved with unnatural speed, their faces obscured by black hoods. Jackson fired instinctively, the crack of the revolver splitting the air. One of the intruders went down, but the others kept coming, their movements eerily coordinated. Go! Jackson shouted, firing again as Calder and Marcus bolted for the basement door. One of the figures lunged at him, a curved blade glinting in the dim light. Jackson sidestepped, bringing the butt of his revolver down hard on the attacker's head. The figure crumpled, but another was already behind him. Jackson backed toward the basement door, firing another shot to keep the attackers at bay. Move it, Calder, he shouted. We don't have time. Calder and Marcus disappeared down the stairs, and Jackson followed, slamming the door shut behind him. He could hear the sound of footsteps above, the intruders swarming the library. But for now, they had a head start. Keep moving, Jackson said, his voice tight. If they catch us in the tunnel, we're done. The tunnel stretched out like a suffocating, endless corridor, its damp air clinging to their skin. Calder's flashlight beam flickered against the slick stone walls, barely illuminating the space ahead. Jackson kept his revolver raised as they moved, his footsteps steady despite the tension crackling in the air. Behind him, Marcus trudged with uneven steps, his breath coming in shallow gasps. They're coming, Marcus said under his breath, his voice shaky. I can hear them. Keep moving, Jackson replied curtly, his voice cutting through the darkness. You can panic when we're out of here. No, Marcus insisted, his head jerking back toward the way they'd come. You don't understand. It's not just footsteps, they're chanting. Jackson froze for half a second, straining to listen. At first, it was barely audible, just a faint murmur carried through the tunnel's emptiness. But as they pressed forward, the sound grew, a low, guttural hum, rhythmic and otherworldly. Calder glanced over his shoulder, his face pale in the dim light. "They're summoning something," Calder whispered, his words trembling. "We need to get out of here. Now." Jackson didn't need another warning. He motioned for Calder to pick up the pace, forcing Marcus to follow. The sound of their own hurried footsteps echoed back at them, blending with the haunting chant that seemed to grow louder with each passing second. The tunnel curved sharply, and as they rounded the corner, a faint glimmer of light appeared in the distance. "The exit," Calder breathed, relief washing over his face. "We're close." But the moment was short-lived. Behind them, the chanting reached a crescendo, and with it came a chilling, unnatural wind that swept through the tunnel. The flashlight flickered violently before plunging them into darkness. Marcus let out a panicked yelp, but Jackson grabbed his arm, dragging him forward. "Keep going," Jackson barked. "We're almost there." The light at the end of the tunnel grew brighter as they closed the distance. Calder reached it first, slamming his hands against a rusted metal hatch embedded in the ceiling. He twisted the wheel desperately, the corroded metal groaning in protest. Jackson turned back, staring into the black void they'd come from. A shadow moved, multiple shadows, writhing like living smoke, closing in fast. "Calder, hurry up!" Jackson shouted, his voice reverberating through the tunnel. "I'm trying." Calder snapped, his knuckles white as he wrenched the wheel with all his strength. With a final screech, the hatch gave way, swinging open to reveal the night sky above. A cool gust of air rushed in, a stark contrast to the suffocating heat of the tunnel. Calder scrambled up the ladder first, pulling himself through the opening. Marcus followed, his movements frantic and uncoordinated. Jackson stood watch at the base of the ladder, his revolver aimed at the approaching darkness. The shadows were closer now, their forms solidifying into humanoid figures with glowing, empty eyes. Jackson fired. The gunshot echoed like thunder, the flash briefly illuminating the tunnel. The nearest figure recoiled, its shape dissolving into mist before reforming seconds later. Jackson cursed under his breath, firing again and again, but it only slowed them down. "Jackson, come on!" Calder's voice called from above. With one last shot, Jackson turned and grabbed the ladder, climbing as fast as he could. The shadows surged forward, their clawed hands reaching for him, but he hauled himself through the hatch just in time. Calder and Marcus slammed it shut, the echoes of chanting cut off as the wheel locked into place. The three of them collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air. The night was silent, save for their ragged breathing. For a moment, none of them spoke, the weight of their escape settling over them like a heavy fog. Finally, Marcus broke the silence. "What the hell were those things?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Jackson didn't answer immediately. He stood, staring out at the dark forest that surrounded them. "Nothing good," he said finally. "And we're not safe yet." The forest stretched before them like an endless maze, its towering trees swaying gently in the cold night wind. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, casting the landscape into near-total darkness. Calder adjusted the strap of his bag, his eyes darting nervously between the trees. Marcus sat on the ground, still catching his breath, his hands trembling as he rubbed his face. "We can't stay here," Jackson said, scanning their surroundings. His voice was steady, but there was a sharp edge to it. "They'll find a way out of that tunnel. And when they do, they'll come for us." "Do you even know where we're going?" Marcus shot back, his voice breaking. "We've been running nonstop since the library." "What's the plan, Jackson? Or are we just running blind?" "The plan," Jackson said, turning to glare at Marcus, "is to get to the sanctuary. It's our only chance." "And you're sure the sanctuary exists?" Marcus pressed, standing now, his fists clenched. Because I'm starting to think we're chasing a damn myth while those things hunt us down. It exists, Calder interrupted, his voice calm but firm. I've seen the maps, the records. It's real. And it's the only place where the shard can be contained. Jackson nodded in agreement, though his grip on the revolver tightened. We don't have time to argue. If you want to stay here and wait for them, be my guest. But I'm not stopping. Marcus hesitated, his anger faltering as fear crept into his expression. Finally, he sighed and gestured for Jackson to lead the way. Fine. But if this sanctuary turns out to be a dead end, we're screwed. They moved quickly, weaving through the dense forest. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves sent shivers down their spines. Calder occasionally glanced behind them, his face etched with worry. The shadows seemed to cling to the edges of their vision, as though the forest itself was alive and watching. After what felt like hours, the group emerged into a clearing. It was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made the hairs on the back of Jackson's neck stand up. At the center of the clearing stood an ancient, crumbling stone altar, covered in moss and strange carvings that seemed to writhe in the faint light. This wasn't on the map, Calder whispered, stepping closer to the altar. What is this place? Doesn't matter, Jackson replied, his eyes scanning the tree line. We're not stopping here. Keep moving. But Calder didn't listen. He approached the altar, his flashlight beam revealing more of the carvings. His brow furrowed as he studied them, his fingers tracing the symbols. These markings, they're warnings, he said, his voice barely audible. Something was sealed here. And we don't want to find out what, Jackson said sharply, grabbing Calder by the arm. Let's go. Before they could take another step, the ground beneath them trembled. A low, guttural sound echoed through the clearing, sending a chill down their spines. The air grew heavy, and a sense of overwhelming dread settled over them. What did you do? Marcus hissed, backing away from the altar. I didn't do anything. Calder insisted, his voice rising in panic. I just... The sound grew louder, and the shadows at the edge of the clearing began to move, coalescing into shapes. Eyes, dozens of glowing, empty eyes, blinked into existence, watching them from the darkness. They're here, Jackson muttered, raising his revolver. Get ready to run. But the shadows didn't attack. Instead, they stayed at the edges of the clearing, as though waiting for something. The trembling stopped, and for a moment, there was only silence. Then, with a deafening crack, the altar split open. A dark, swirling energy poured out, pulsating like a living thing. Calder stumbled back, his face pale. That's not possible, he whispered. It's... Before he could finish, a voice boomed through the clearing, deep and ancient, reverberating in their very bones. You carry the shard, it said. And you bring it, here? Jackson's grip on his revolver tightened as he stepped forward, shielding Calder and Marcus. Who's there? He demanded. Show yourself. The swirling energy coalesced into a towering figure, its form shifting and undefined, like a shadow given life. It had no face, but its presence was suffocating, its power radiating outward in waves. You have disrupted the balance, the figure said, its voice like a storm. The shard belongs to me. Surrender it, and I may yet spare your lives. Not a chance, Jackson said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. If you want it, you'll have to come and take it. The figure let out a rumbling laugh, the sound echoing through the clearing. Foolish mortals. You cannot comprehend the forces at play. The shadows at the edges of the clearing began to close in, their glowing eyes fixed on the group. Jackson glanced at Calder and Marcus. Run, he said, his voice firm. Now. But, Marcus began, but Jackson cut him off. Go. I'll hold them off. Without waiting for a response, he fired his revolver, the gunshot shattering the tension. The shadows recoiled, and Calder grabbed Marcus by the arm, dragging him toward the other side of the clearing. Jackson stood his ground, his revolver blazing as he faced the impossible enemy. Calder and Marcus sprinted into the dense forest, the sounds of Jackson's gunfire ringing out behind them. The flicker of muzzled flashes lit the clearing in bursts, illuminating the writhing shadows and the towering figure at the altar. Calder's breaths came in ragged gasps, his chest burning as he pushed himself to keep moving. Marcus stumbled over a root but caught himself, his face pale and drenched in sweat. "He's going to die back there," Marcus shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "We can't just leave him. If we go back, we'll all die." Calder shot back, his grip tightening on the strap of his bag. "Jackson knows what he's doing. He's buying us time." "What good is time if we're running blind?" Marcus yelled, but Calder didn't answer. He couldn't. He didn't have a plan. The sanctuary felt like a distant, unreachable dream, and the weight of the shard in his bag grew heavier with every step. Behind them, the forest erupted with an unearthly roar. The sound was so loud it seemed to shake the very ground beneath them. Marcus skidded to a halt, turning back toward the commotion. What the hell was that? Calder grabbed his arm, forcing him to keep running. "We don't want to find out. Just move." The two pushed deeper into the forest, the trees growing thicker and the darkness more oppressive. Calder's flashlight flickered dangerously, its beam cutting weakly through the shadows. The air was colder now, biting at their skin, and an unnatural stillness seemed to settle over the woods. Even the distant sound of Jackson's gunfire had vanished. "Do you think he made it?" Marcus asked breathlessly, his voice barely above a whisper. Calder hesitated, glancing back over his shoulder. The forest behind them was eerily still, the clearing now hidden by the trees. He wanted to say yes, to reassure Marcus, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he pressed forward, focusing on the faint path ahead. Then, just as they thought they'd escaped the worst, a soft sound reached their ears. It was faint at first, like the rustle of leaves, but it grew louder with each passing second. Calder froze, his flashlight trembling in his hand. Marcus gripped his arm, his eyes wide with fear. "They're here," Marcus whispered, his breath fogging in the cold air. The shadows moved between the trees, slipping silently through the darkness. Eyes, those same glowing, empty eyes, appeared in the distance, blinking into existence one by one. Calder cursed under his breath, his mind racing. They couldn't outrun them, not in this terrain. "Over there," Calder said, pointing to a cluster of large rocks jutting out from the forest floor. "We can hide. Come on." The two of them scrambled toward the rocks, squeezing into a narrow crevice just wide enough to conceal them. Calder switched off the flashlight, plunging them into darkness. They pressed their backs against the cold stone, their breaths shallow as they listened. The rustling grew closer, accompanied by the faint hum of that same haunting chant. Calder gritted his teeth, willing his pounding heart to quiet. Through a small gap in the rocks, he could see the shadows moving, their forms twisting unnaturally. They drifted through the trees, searching, their eyes scanning the forest floor. One of the figures paused, its glowing eyes fixating on their hiding spot. Calder felt his stomach lurch, his hand instinctively clutching the strap of his bag. He could feel the shard pulsing faintly inside, as though it was alive, reacting to the presence of the creatures. Marcus's hand shot out, gripping Calder's arm so tightly it hurt. "They know," Marcus mouthed, his eyes wide with terror. The figure began to drift closer, its movements slow but deliberate. Calder's mind raced. If they stayed hidden, they might be discovered. If they ran, they'd be caught. His fingers brushed against the zipper of his bag, his thoughts turning to the shard. He didn't know how to use it, didn't even fully understand what it was, but if it was what these things wanted, maybe it could be their weapon. The figure was nearly upon them now, its clawed hand reaching out toward the crevice. Calder's breath caught in his throat, his fingers tightening around the bag's zipper. But before he could act, a deafening roar tore through the forest. The creature recoiled, its form twisting violently before melting into the shadows. The other figures froze, their heads snapping toward the source of the sound. Calder and Marcus exchanged a glance, their fear momentarily replaced by confusion. The roar came again, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps crashing through the underbrush. Trees splintered and fell as something massive approached, its presence sending the shadowy figures into disarray. They scattered, their glowing eyes blinking out one by one until the forest was silent once more. Calder peeked out from the crevice, his heart pounding. He couldn't see what had caused the commotion, but the ground still trembled faintly beneath them. Whatever it was close, and it was big. "What now?" Marcus whispered, his voice shaking. "Do we stay here? Do we run?" Calder didn't answer immediately. His gaze was fixed on the darkness, his mind racing. Whatever had scared off the shadows could just as easily turn its attention to them. But staying put didn't feel safe either. "We move," Calder said finally, his voice firm despite the fear gnawing at him. "Quietly. And fast." Marcus nodded, his face pale but determined. Together, they slipped out from their hiding spot, their movements slow and deliberate. The forest was eerily quiet again, the oppressive stillness returning. But something had changed. The air felt heavier, charged with an energy Calder couldn't explain. As they crept forward, Calder's thoughts returned to Jackson. He wanted to believe the man was still alive, that he'd somehow fought his way out of the clearing. But deep down, he knew the odds weren't in their favor. All they could do now was keep moving, and hope that whatever had saved them wouldn't turn into their next nightmare. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly before them, but Calder and Marcus pressed on, driven by equal parts desperation and instinct. The strange energy lingering in the air made their skin crawl, urging them to move faster even as exhaustion weighed heavily on their limbs. Calder's flashlight flickered back to life, casting weak beams of light through the trees. The shard in his bag felt heavier than ever, its faint pulses synchronizing uncomfortably with his own heartbeat. "Do you think we're close?" Marcus asked, his voice low, as though afraid the forest itself might be listening. "We have to be," Calder replied, though he had no way of knowing. He kept his eyes forward, scanning for any sign of a path or marker, anything that might guide them. His mind raced with fragments of the maps he'd studied back at the library, trying to match the terrain to the faded lines and symbols. But the forest seemed to warp and twist, defying any sense of direction. Finally, they broke through a dense thicket and stumbled into another clearing. This one was different, not empty like the last, but filled with stone ruins, their surfaces carved with symbols similar to those on the altar. A massive archway stood at the center, shrouded in vines and moss. Its ancient, weathered surface pulsed faintly with the same energy that Calder felt from the shard. "This has to be it," Calder said, his voice barely above a whisper. He stepped toward the archway, pulling the bag from his shoulder. The shard inside seemed to hum louder, as though responding to the structure. Marcus stayed back, his eyes darting nervously around the clearing. "You're sure about this? What if this is another trap?" "It's not," Calder said, though he wasn't entirely sure. "The sanctuary is real. And this is the gateway." He unzipped the bag and carefully pulled out the shard. It was small, no larger than a fist, but its surface shimmered with an unnatural light, swirling as though alive. As Calder approached the archway, the shard's glow intensified, and the air around it seemed to vibrate. The ground trembled again, but this time it felt different, calmer, almost purposeful. The carvings on the archway lit up one by one, golden light weaving through the symbols like veins. The hum of the shard grew louder, resonating with the structure. "You're going to open it, aren't you?" Marcus asked, his voice tinged with both awe and fear. "What if something worse is on the other side?" Calder turned to face him, the shard catching the faint light of the ruins. "If we don't, the shadows will keep coming. They'll hunt us forever. Whatever's in there might be our only chance." Before Marcus could respond, a low, familiar voice cut through the clearing. "Don't." Both men froze, their heads snapping toward the trees. Jackson emerged from the shadows, his revolver holstered but his face pale and bloodied. His coat was torn, and his movements were slow, but he was alive. "Jackson!" Marcus exclaimed, relief flooding his voice. You made it. Jackson stopped a few paces from them, his eyes fixed on the shard. You have no idea what you're about to unleash, he said, his tone grave. The sanctuary isn't just a place. It's a prison. Calder's chest tightened. What are you talking about? The maps, the records, it said this was the only way to contain the shard. It's a lie, Jackson said, stepping closer. The shard doesn't need to be contained. It needs to be destroyed. The sanctuary isn't salvation, it's a vault for something far worse. If you open that gate, you'll doom us all. Calder hesitated, his grip on the shard tightening. He looked back at the archway, its carvings glowing brighter with each passing second, then at Jackson, whose eyes burned with a desperate intensity. You're asking me to trust you, Calder said, his voice wavering. But we've been running, fighting for our lives, because of this thing. If we don't stop it now, when will it ever end? It ends when we take control, Jackson replied firmly. Destroy the shard, Calder. Don't let it control you. Don't let it win. The ground trembled more violently now, the symbols on the archway blazing with golden light. The shard in Calder's hand felt hot, its hum turning into a sharp, piercing tone. Marcus stepped back, shielding his eyes from the brightness. Calder, decide. Marcus shouted. What are you going to do? Calder's mind raced. Every decision he'd made up to this point had been based on the belief that the sanctuary was their salvation. But Jackson's words gnawed at him, planting seeds of doubt. Was the gateway truly a way out, or a doorway to something far worse? He looked at the shard, its swirling light almost hypnotic, and then at the trembling archway. Finally, he made his choice. With a deep breath, Calder raised the shard and hurled it to the ground with all his strength. The shard shattered on impact, releasing a blinding burst of light that knocked all three of them off their feet. The air filled with an ear-splitting crack, and for a moment it felt as though the entire world had stopped. The glowing symbols on the archway flickered and died, the energy within them dissipating into nothingness. When the light faded, the clearing was silent. The oppressive weight in the air was gone, and the forest seemed to exhale, the tension that had gripped it lifting. Calder pushed himself to his knees, his vision blurry, his ears ringing. Jackson stood slowly, brushing dirt from his jacket. You did the right thing, he said, his voice low but steady. The shard's power is gone. They won't hunt us anymore. Marcus sat on the ground, staring at the shattered fragments of the shard. So, it's over? He asked, his tone disbelieving. For now, Jackson replied, his gaze shifting to the dark forest around them. But there's always another shadow waiting to rise. We just have to be ready. Calder nodded, his exhaustion finally catching up with him. The weight of the shard was gone, but the scars it left behind would remain. As the three of them stood in the clearing, the first rays of dawn began to break through the trees, casting light on a world that, for the moment, was safe once more.